Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, was the kind of town where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns and cozy suburban homes created an air of tranquility where neighbors exchanged smiles and children played carefree on the sidewalks. In this serene neighborhood, Julie and Mark Jensen appeared to be the embodiment of suburban success. Julie, a devoted mother to their two young sons, spent her days balancing PTA meetings and playdates. Mark, a corporate employee, was the breadwinner, often seen mowing the lawn or chatting amicably with the neighbors. Together, they seemed to live the American dream. But behind the perfectly painted shutters of the Jensen household, unease brewed. Julie had begun to notice subtle cracks in the veneer of their idyllic life. Mark, once attentive and warm, had grown distant. He often retreated into his study late at night, the faint glow of his computer screen visible under the door. "Work," he would say when Julie questioned him, his tone clipped and final. Julie tried to dismiss her growing discomfort. After all, every marriage had its ebbs and flows, didn't it? Still, there was something about Mark's demeanor that unsettled her. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen, she noticed a faint, sweet smell wafting from the garage. She wrinkled her nose and made a mental note to ask Mark about it later. But when she did, his response was abrupt. "Probably just something I spilled," he said, barely looking up from his phone. Julie's unease deepened one morning as she sorted through the household bills. Mark had always managed their finances, but an unfamiliar charge caught her eye, a large purchase from a hardware store. Curious, she opened the accompanying receipt and found an itemized list: antifreeze, cleaning agents, and other industrial supplies. She frowned, puzzled. These weren't typical purchases for their home. When she brought it up with Mark later that day, his reaction was immediate and dismissive. "I'm working on a project," he said, waving her off. "Nothing to worry about." But Julie did worry. She couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, memories of their earlier years together flooded her mind. Mark had been attentive, even doting back then. Now there was a coldness to him, an indifference that felt almost deliberate. The distance between them had grown into a chasm she couldn't cross. A few days later, the feeling of unease turned into outright suspicion. Julie walked into the living room to find Mark on a phone call. His voice was hushed, and his back was turned to her. As she stepped closer, she caught snippets of his conversation. "Don't worry, it's handled," he said, his tone calm and measured. Julie froze. Handled? What did that mean? Mark ended the call abruptly as soon as he noticed her presence. His expression was unreadable as he slipped the phone into his pocket. "Who was that?" Julie asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Work," Mark replied, his tone curt. He walked past her without another word, leaving her standing there, the weight of his vague response pressing heavily on her chest. Later that evening, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her hair, Julie caught her own reflection and saw the worry etched across her face. She didn't recognize herself. The woman who had once been so confident and secure, now she was a shadow of that person, gripped by a sense of foreboding she couldn't explain. She knew one thing for certain: something was terribly wrong, and she would find out what it was, no matter the cost. Julie couldn't let go of the strange phone call she overheard, and Mark's vague explanations did little to ease her unease. Over the following days, her mind buzzed with unanswered questions. She began noticing other peculiarities, each one chipping away at the trust she once had in her husband. One morning, as Julie sat at the kitchen table sorting through their bills, she stumbled upon another puzzling transaction. It was from a local hardware store dated just a week prior. The purchase included more items she couldn't explain: containers of antifreeze, solvents, and gloves. Her stomach tightened as she reread the list. What project could Mark possibly be working on that required such supplies? When Mark came home that evening, Julie decided to confront him directly. "Mark," she said, holding up the receipt, "what is this about? I don't remember us needing antifreeze or any of these chemicals." Mark glanced at the paper in her hand, his expression flickering with annoyance before he quickly masked it. "I told you, Julie. I'm fixing the pipes in the garage. The antifreeze is for the car. You know how Wisconsin winters are." His tone was curt, dismissive, as if the conversation were beneath him. Julie didn't push further, but something about his demeanor unsettled her. This wasn't the Mark she knew. She replayed the moment in her mind later that night, lying awake while Mark snored softly beside her. His answers felt rehearsed, calculated. She didn't believe him, but what could she do? In the days that followed, Julie became more observant. She noticed Mark retreating to his study more often, shutting the door behind him and staying there for hours. Once, while passing by, she caught a glimpse of his computer screen. It looked like he was reading something, but before she could see more, Mark shut the laptop abruptly. "What is it?" Julie asked, trying to sound casual. "Work emails," Mark said flatly, standing up to block her view. "You wouldn't understand." The deflection stung, but Julie let it go, at least outwardly. She resolved to find out more. That night, after Mark had gone to bed, Julie crept into his study. Her hands trembled as she powered on his laptop. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she felt a gnawing certainty that the truth was somewhere inside. The first thing she saw was his search history. Her heart dropped as her eyes scanned the phrases: symptoms of antifreeze poisoning, how to poison undetected, and how much antifreeze is lethal. A cold wave of fear washed over her. She leaned back in the chair, her breathing shallow, her mind racing. Julie closed the laptop carefully, terrified of leaving a trace. Her mind screamed for answers, but she knew she couldn't confront Mark directly, not yet. Instead, she needed a plan. She needed proof. The following morning, Julie confided in Susan, their next-door neighbor. Susan was someone Julie trusted implicitly, someone who had always been there with a listening ear. "I think Mark is hiding something," Julie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what, but it's bad. I can feel it." Susan frowned, concern etched across her face. "Julie, do you think you're in danger?" "I don't know," Julie replied, her voice cracking. "But I need to be ready, just in case." Susan nodded, her hand resting on Julie's arm. "You know you can count on me for anything, just say the word." Julie's paranoia deepened that evening when Mark's behavior shifted yet again. He was unusually attentive at dinner, asking about her day and engaging with the kids. But Julie saw through it. It felt forced, like an act he was trying too hard to maintain. When the kids left the table, Mark leaned closer to her, his eyes locked on hers. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Is everything okay?" Julie hesitated, forcing a smile. "Of course, just tired." But as Mark studied her, she felt the weight of his gaze. For the first time in their marriage, she was truly afraid of the man sitting across from her. Julie couldn't shake the feeling that she was slowly unraveling something she wasn't supposed to know. The search history she had discovered on Mark's computer haunted her every waking moment. Symptoms of antifreeze poisoning, how to poison undetected, how much antifreeze is lethal. The phrases danced in her mind like an eerie chant. The dots were starting to connect in her head, but the picture was too terrifying to process. The next few days felt like a blur. Julie moved through them mechanically, her mind fixated on the truth she wasn't ready to face. She kept quiet, pretending nothing was wrong, while Mark acted as if everything was perfectly fine. He seemed normal, perhaps too normal. He played the part of a caring husband, often checking in with her, even helping with dinner. But Julie saw through it. His forced kindness felt like an act, a way to mask the tension that simmered between them. On the morning of the fourth day after her discovery, Julie decided she couldn't live with the doubt any longer. She had to confront Mark. She had to know the truth, even if it shattered her. She could feel the weight of the secrets he was keeping pressing down on her chest. With her heart pounding in her ears, she waited until they were alone in the kitchen. "Mark, we need to talk," Julie said, her voice tight with fear. Mark turned to face her, his expression neutral. "What's on your mind?" Julie took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I found something on your computer. The searches, about poisoning." Mark's eyes flickered with something she couldn't read, and for a split second she could almost see him calculating his response. He set down the knife he had been holding and wiped his hands on a dish towel before looking back at her. "Julie, that's ridiculous," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're jumping to conclusions. I've been researching something for work, and it's unrelated to you." Julie's heart raced. His answer felt rehearsed, too smooth to be believable. "Don't lie to me, Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "Why are you looking up poison? What were you planning?" He stared at her for a long moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, his jaw clenched. Mark stepped closer, his presence looming over her, and Julie instinctively took a step back. "I don't know what you think you saw, but you need to let it go. You're imagining things," Mark said, his voice low and cold. Julie's stomach twisted. She had never seen this side of him before. The man who used to be gentle and loving was now threatening and dismissive. She realized in that moment just how much had changed between them. Mark wasn't the man she had married. "Mark, I'm scared," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "What are you planning? I need to know." Mark's eyes softened for a moment, and for a fleeting second, Julie thought he might tell her the truth. But then just as quickly, his expression hardened again. He reached out, gently taking her hand. "You're just stressed," he said, his voice returning to a soothing tone. "Everything's fine. You have nothing to worry about." Julie wanted to believe him, she really did. But the doubt that had been planted in her mind was too deep to ignore. She pulled her hand away from his grasp and took a step back. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll figure it out myself." As Mark left the room, Julie felt her resolve hardening. She couldn't just sit back and let him continue lying. She needed answers. She needed to protect herself and her children. That night, when Mark was asleep, Julie made a decision. She would find out the truth, no matter what it took. She would gather the evidence she needed to expose what Mark had been hiding, and she would do it before it was too late. Julie's suspicions had been growing for weeks, but it wasn't until the afternoon she saw Mark meeting someone outside the local cafe that everything changed. At first, she thought it might just be a colleague, someone from his office. But as she watched from her car, hidden in the shadows, she saw something in their interaction that made her heart race with panic. Mark was laughing, something he hadn't done with her in a long time, and the woman was smiling back at him in a way that felt too familiar. They were standing too close, their body language too intimate. Julie's breath caught in her throat. The woman had long, dark hair, dressed casually, and the way they interacted made it clear this wasn't a business meeting. There was a spark between them, one that Julie had long since stopped seeing in her own marriage. Julie didn't approach them. Instead, she sat in her car, watching through the window as they exchanged a quick hug before parting ways. Mark kissed the woman on the cheek before heading back to his car. A sickening realization washed over Julie. This wasn't just some casual colleague, this was an affair. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. Who was she? Was this the reason Mark had been so distant lately? The reason he'd been spending more time in his study, avoiding their home life? Julie's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. She couldn't confront him right now, not yet. She needed more answers. Later that night, she casually asked Mark about the meeting. "You seemed in a good mood earlier," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Who was that woman you were talking to at the cafe?" Mark's reaction was immediate. His face stiffened, and for a split second, Julie saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked like guilt, quickly masked by a forced smile. "Just a colleague from work," he replied, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. Julie pressed on. "You looked close. Is everything okay?" "It's nothing, Julie," he said, brushing off the question. "Just work stuff. Don't make a big deal out of it." But Julie knew better now. The image of Mark and the woman, laughing and talking as if they were more than just colleagues, burned in her mind. She couldn't ignore it. There was something deeper going on, and it was eating at her. The next day, Julie took a different approach. She began digging into Mark's routine, searching for any more signs of the affair. She knew it was wrong to pry, but something told her that if she didn't act now, she might never get another chance. She found a couple of recent messages on his phone, exchanged late at night. They were from the same woman, but they weren't strictly professional. The tone was too familiar, too personal. Julie's stomach churned as she read through the messages. One text from the woman read, "I miss you. I can't wait until we're together again." Julie could barely breathe as she read the words. She had suspected something was going on, but now the proof was in front of her. She felt the tears well up in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had to stay strong. Mark had been playing a dangerous game, but she had no intention of letting him get away with it. That evening, after Mark came home, Julie decided to confront him once more, this time with the evidence in hand. "Mark," she said, her voice steady but her hands shaking, "I know about her. The woman you've been seeing." Mark's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For a moment, they both just stood there, the tension hanging thick in the air. "You've been lying to me for months," Julie continued, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "How long has this been going on? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. "Julie, it's not what you think. I never meant for you to find out like this." Julie wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The man standing in front of her wasn't the man she had married. He was a stranger, someone who had betrayed her in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. "You never meant for me to find out?" Julie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You've been seeing her behind my back and you think I wouldn't find out?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, clearly panicked. Julie, I don't know what happened. It just, don't. Julie cut him off, her voice shaking with the weight of her disappointment. I don't want to hear it. And just like that, Julie realized that her worst fear had come true. Mark was no longer the man she had trusted, and everything she thought she knew about their life together was a lie. Julie sat at the kitchen table, the letter in front of her. Her hands trembled as she read over the words again, her mind racing. The paper seemed heavier with each word she read. Her stomach churned, knowing she was writing a message she might never be able to send. But if anything happened to her, at least someone would know the truth. She had spent hours carefully writing her fears, her suspicions. Everything she had discovered about Mark, everything he had done. The letter was her final attempt to protect herself, her children, and her sanity. She could not let herself believe that her life, the life they had built together, was built on lies and betrayal. But the truth was undeniable. If something were to happen to her, the world would have to know what Mark had become, the monster that had quietly crept into her life. The words on the page spilled out of her. If anything happens to me, I would never take my own life because of my children. My husband, Mark Jensen, should be the first suspect. She paused, her pen hovering over the next line. A lump formed in her throat, and her chest tightened. Her mind flashed to Mark's face as he'd lied to her again and again. She couldn't shake the image of him, calm, collected, deceiving her at every turn. She continued writing, pouring every ounce of fear and sadness into the paper. He's been hiding things from me. The things I found, the chemicals, the late nights on his computer, the strange behavior. This isn't just coincidence. Julie knew she couldn't confront him yet. Mark had been more erratic than usual, and she feared what might happen if she pushed him further. But she had to prepare. She had to make sure her children would be protected if she was wrong and he took her life. She folded the letter carefully as if tucking away a final piece of her soul. She knew this was the right thing to do, but the question still lingered in her mind. Would it be enough? Would it even make a difference if Mark had already made up his mind about her fate? The door creaked open behind her, and Julie quickly slid the letter into the drawer, heart pounding. Mark stepped into the kitchen, a forced smile on his face. His eyes were cold, but she couldn't quite read them. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice casual, almost too casual. Julie nodded, fighting to keep her emotions under control. "Yeah, just tired." Mark didn't press her further. He was always so good at sensing when she was upset, but it seemed tonight he was content to let her be. He poured himself a drink and sat down at the counter, his back to her. Julie's hands remained clenched tightly in her lap, as if willing herself to stay calm. She had to hold it together, at least for tonight. She couldn't risk showing him her fear. As she watched him sip his drink, Julie's mind returned to the letter. She knew that deep down, she had no other choice but to prepare for the worst. It was the only way she could ensure her children would be safe and that her suspicions wouldn't be ignored. That night, as she lay in bed next to Mark, she stared at the ceiling, the sound of his breathing beside her eerily calm. The weight of the letter in the drawer felt like an anchor, heavy with the burden of her decisions. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time her eyes fluttered shut, her thoughts returned to Mark, his lies, his coldness, his detachment. The next morning, Julie woke early, still exhausted from the restless night, but with the letter still fresh in her mind. She couldn't get rid of it. Her need to protect her children, to ensure they knew the truth, overshadowed any fear she had of confronting Mark. She had to act, and she had to do it soon. Julie reached for her phone, opening her contacts. She stared at the name of her closest friend, the person she had confided in before. Without another thought, she tapped the screen. "I need to talk to you," she typed quickly. "Something's wrong." Julie hit send and set the phone down, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders just slightly. She wasn't alone in this. She had someone on her side. The doorbell rang shortly after, and Julie's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the visitor so soon. Mark was in the shower, and she used the moment to slip out of the house and meet her friend. She had no idea what she was walking into, but the feeling in her gut told her she was running out of time. Julie hadn't been able to shake the sick feeling in her stomach all day. The confrontation with Mark had left her uneasy, but it was his reaction, the coldness in his eyes, the way he had avoided her questions, that unsettled her most. She hadn't pressed him further, but the seeds of doubt had already taken root in her mind. She wasn't just suspicious anymore, She was certain something was wrong, and her gut told her that tonight she had to act. That evening, Mark had gone out for a quick errand, and Julie had taken the opportunity to make a phone call to her closest friend, Sarah. She had tried to stay calm, but she knew the situation was escalating. "Sarah, I need your help. I can't keep pretending everything's fine," she confessed, her voice shaky. "I don't know what to do anymore." Sarah's response was immediate and supportive. "Julie, I've got your back. You need to protect yourself. Just make sure you're safe. I'll be there soon." Julie hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. At least she wasn't completely alone in this, but the terror in her chest refused to subside. She thought of the letter she had written, the one she had hidden away for safekeeping. If anything were to happen, it was the only piece of evidence that could expose Mark for what he truly was. It wasn't long before she heard Mark's car pulling into the driveway. She quickly tucked her phone away and wiped the tears from her eyes, trying to mask her anxiety. Mark entered the house with his usual indifference, tossing his keys on the table. "You okay?" he asked, though his tone was more of an afterthought than genuine concern. "Yeah," Julie said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and moved to the kitchen. Julie couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. She had no idea how much longer she could keep up this facade. As she sat at the kitchen table, pretending to organize some papers, she noticed Mark move to the refrigerator and take out a bottle of wine. He didn't offer her a glass. Julie instinctively tightened her grip on her coffee mug. She had been thinking about everything, about Mark, about their marriage, and most of all about the terrifying realization that the man she had once loved might be capable of something unthinkable. She forced herself to breathe evenly as Mark poured himself a drink. She had never felt so detached from him in all these years. The closeness they once shared now felt like a distant memory, swallowed by the distance he had created between them. Suddenly, Mark spoke, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, not looking at her. "What's going on?" Julie felt a flash of panic. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest as she tried to maintain composure. She couldn't let him know how close she was to unraveling everything. She couldn't let him see the fear that had taken root in her heart. "I'm just tired, Mark," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for months. She knew now that Mark was hiding something, something far more dangerous than a simple affair. The lies were deeper, the secrets darker, and the more she pushed to uncover the truth, the more she realized how much he was willing to do to maintain control. A sudden chill ran through her as she heard the sound of the door to the garage closing. Mark's shadow moved across the hallway, but Julie's mind was still racing. She had never felt so trapped. It was as though the walls were closing in on her and she couldn't breathe. Then it happened. A sudden wave of dizziness swept over her and she staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the table for support. She blinked hard, but the world seemed to spin in front of her eyes. Her breath quickened. This was it. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her body and her every cell. Julie fought to stay on her feet, but the dizziness only intensified. "Julie?" Mark's voice rang out, but it sounded far away. "You okay?" She didn't answer him. She could barely stand. Her body felt heavy, as if something was weighing her down. Her mind flashed to the research she had found on Mark's computer. The searches, the symptoms, the poisons. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She was being poisoned. Julie stumbled toward the hallway, her vision blurring. She had to get to the phone. She had to call for help. But as she reached for the door, she collapsed. The last thing she heard before everything went black was Mark's voice, soft but full of something she couldn't quite place. "You should have trusted me, Julie." Julie awoke with a start, her body heavy and unresponsive, as if she were submerged underwater. The room around her was dim, and for a moment she couldn't quite make sense of where she was. Her head pounded. She felt nauseous, dizzy, and disoriented. The smell of something faintly chemical clung to the air, and a sense of dread washed over her as she tried to push herself up. But the effort was too much. Her limbs felt like lead. The last thing she remembered was walking toward the door, trying to escape, but everything after that was a blur. Had she collapsed? Was she still dreaming? Her mind raced, but she couldn't seem to connect the dots. "Julie?" Mark's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. He stood by the bed, watching her with that same controlled calm that she had come to dread. There was a strange, almost casual tone in his voice, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was fine. "What happened?" Julie managed to croak, struggling to sit up. Why can't I move?" "You fainted, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice smooth. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." Julie's eyes flitted around the room. It wasn't the first time she'd felt disoriented, but it was the first time she hadn't been able to shake it. Her head throbbed with every breath. "What did you give me?" Mark's expression faltered just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Julie to see it. It was the same look of guilt she had seen on his face the night he lied to her. But then it was gone, replaced with his usual mask. "I didn't give you anything," he replied, his voice too soft, too calm. "You just need to rest. I'll call the doctor if you want, but you need to relax." Julie's stomach turned. There it was again, the sense that Mark was hiding something, that there was more to this than he was willing to admit. But before she could press him further, the phone rang. Mark's eyes flickered to it for just a moment, and Julie saw a flash of something unreadable in his gaze. Without hesitation, he picked it up and answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice light, almost too light. "Yes, everything's fine here. Just a little scare. No big deal." Julie couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but the way Mark spoke made her uneasy. He was too convincing, too dismissive. It was like he was covering something up. After a few minutes, Mark hung up the phone, his expression now back to normal, calm, detached. That was work. Nothing to worry about. He turned away from her, his back to her as he busied himself with something on the counter. Julie's heart raced. This wasn't right. None of it was. She tried to focus, to think clearly, but the confusion was clouding her mind. She knew that Mark was hiding something, and the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The strange behaviors, the chemicals, the lies, it was all pointing to one thing. She needed to be sure. She had to get the evidence. If she didn't, she would never know the full truth. She couldn't let him get away with it, not again. Julie forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. Mark didn't seem to notice as she slowly made her way to the desk, where her phone was charging. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, and quickly began scrolling through the messages she had received over the past few days. She couldn't help herself. She had to know. Her stomach dropped when she saw the message from Sarah. "Julie, I'm worried. I haven't heard from you. Please, let me know you're okay." She had been trying to reach Julie since that morning, but Julie hadn't responded. Her heart ached, realizing just how much she had been ignoring her friends and how much she had been pushing away. But she couldn't focus on that now. Julie quickly typed out a response to Sarah. "I'm fine, just need to rest. Please don't worry." She hit send before her thoughts could spiral out of control. But something in the back of her mind kept nagging at her. This wasn't just a fainting spell or stress. It was more than that. Julie had felt something foreign coursing through her body, something wrong, something intentional. She had to figure out what it was. She had to find the truth, no matter what it took. Mark turned around then, his eyes narrowing slightly, when he saw Julie standing. "I think you need to lie down," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're not well. Please, just rest." Julie stood her ground, her fear outweighing the exhaustion that clung to her. "No, Mark, I'm fine. I need to find out what's going on." His eyes flashed with something cold, something dangerous. It was brief, but it was enough. "Julie, stop," he warned, his voice low. "You're overthinking things, trust me." But Julie wasn't listening anymore. She couldn't. Not when she knew that something was wrong. She would find out what it was, and she wouldn't stop until she did. Julie's heart raced as she moved through the house, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few days. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, the unease gnawed at her. The dizziness, the disorientation. It wasn't just stress. She was being poisoned. There was no other explanation. But how could she prove it? How could she expose the man she once loved, the man she thought she knew so well? As Julie walked past the kitchen window, her gaze caught a flash of movement outside. Her neighbor, Susan, walking across the yard with a grocery bag in hand. A thought struck her and her pulse quickened. Susan. She'd confided in her earlier about her growing fears. Maybe it was time to take things a step further. Without hesitation, Julie grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, her footsteps quickening as she approached Susan. She hadn't seen much of her lately, but the concern in Susan's eyes when they last spoke had been enough to make Julie feel less alone. Now it seemed like the perfect time to reach out again, to gather any information that could help her understand what was really going on. "Susan," Julie called, her voice shaky but determined. Susan turned at the sound of her name, a smile on her face that quickly faded when she saw the look of urgency in Julie's eyes. "Julie, what's going on? You don't look so good." Julie swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I need to talk to you. It's important." They both walked toward Susan's front door, and Julie glanced over her shoulder nervously, her eyes darting to the windows of her own house. Mark was inside, but she wasn't sure how much he was paying attention. He hadn't been as suspicious lately, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was always watching, always waiting for her to slip up. Once inside Susan's house, Julie sat down on the couch, her hands shaking in her lap. Susan sat across from her, concern etched on her face. "What's going on, Julie? You've been acting so strange lately. You've got to tell me." Julie took a deep breath and tried to steady her racing heart. "I think Mark is hiding something from me. I think he's poisoning me." The words hit the air like a slap, and for a moment Susan didn't respond. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Julie, are you sure?" Julie nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been feeling sick, dizzy, weak. I can't explain it. I found things, chemicals in our garage, things he's bought, and there's more, but I don't know what to do." Susan stood up suddenly, her hands trembling. "You're not imagining things, are you? This is real?" Julie met her gaze, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "I wish I was imagining it, but I'm not. I've felt it. I'm not crazy." Susan paced back and forth for a moment, her mind clearly racing, then her face softened. "Julie, there's something I need to tell you. I saw something a few days ago, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that you're saying this..." Julie's heart skipped a beat. "What did you see?" Susan stopped pacing and looked at Julie with a serious expression. "I saw Mark. He was out by the garage late at night. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then I noticed he was pouring something into a bottle. It looked like antifreeze, and he was careful about making sure no one saw." Julie felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected, but hearing Susan's words confirmed everything she had been afraid to admit. Mark had been careful, too careful. "I knew something was off," Julie whispered, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know how far he'd go." Susan reached out and placed a hand on Julie's. "You need to be careful. You need to get help. This is too serious to handle alone." Julie nodded slowly, her mind whirling. Susan was right. She couldn't do this on her own. She needed to act, but she had to be smart about it. Mark couldn't know what she was planning. She had to make sure everything was in place before she confronted him. "I'm going to call the doctor," Julie said finally, her voice firming. "I'll get a second opinion. I'll have them test me for poisoning. But I need you to keep this between us for now, Susan. I don't want Mark to suspect anything." Susan nodded, her face a mix of worry and resolve. "You're not alone in this, Julie. I'll help you however I can." Julie stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve stronger than it had been in days. She couldn't let Mark get away with what he had done. She had to protect herself, her children, and her future. There was no turning back now. The days after her conversation with Susan had been a blur of anxiety and fear. Julie knew she couldn't stay passive any longer. She had to find the truth and protect herself before it was too late. She had been searching for answers everywhere, but the most unexpected revelation came when she least expected it. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Julie received an anonymous text. It read, "I know what Mark is doing. Meet me." The number was unfamiliar, but the message felt too personal, too direct to ignore. Her heart raced as she considered the possibility. Someone knew about Mark's betrayal, someone who had been close enough to see it firsthand. Julie hesitated for only a moment before she replied, "Where?" The response came quickly. "The park by the lake, 2 p.m. I'll be waiting." Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as she made her way to the park. The air was thick with tension, and her every step seemed weighed down by the unknown. She had no idea what she was walking into, but deep down, she knew this could be the break she had been desperately searching for. When Julie arrived, the park was nearly empty, save for one woman sitting on a bench near the water. The woman looked up as Julie approached, and Julie's breath caught in her throat. It was Karen, the woman she had seen Mark with at the cafe, the woman who had been more than just a colleague. Julie's eyes widened in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. Karen stood up slowly, her face a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Julie," she said softly, "I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Julie's mind spun. She could feel the anger rising within her, but at the same time there was an overwhelming sense of confusion. What was Karen doing here? Why was she willing to meet with Julie now? Why are you doing this? Julie asked, her voice trembling. What do you want from me? Karen hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice heavy with regret. I never wanted this to happen. Mark told me lies. He said he was unhappy with you, that you two were having problems. He made me believe he was leaving you. He promised me a future. Julie's heart dropped as Karen continued. But the more I learned about him, the more I realized how manipulative he was. I didn't want to be a part of this. I never signed up to hurt anyone. The words hit Julie like a slap to the face. Mark had been seeing her for months. He had been planning to leave Julie all along, and now, Karen was confessing that it wasn't just a casual affair. It was something far deeper, something calculated. I'm not proud of what I did, Karen added, her eyes full of shame, but I can't live with myself knowing what he's done. I was just as much a victim as you were. He used me. Julie stood there, silent, processing the revelation. The betrayal stung more than she could have imagined. Not only had Mark been cheating on her, but he had been lying to Karen too. He had manipulated them both, weaving a web of deceit that spanned months. Julie took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling over her like a crushing wave. She wanted to scream at Karen, to unleash the fury that was building up inside her, but something in Karen's eyes stopped her. There was no more anger in this moment, only sadness. Karen had been used, just like Julie. What do you want from me? Julie asked again, her voice quieter this time, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Karen swallowed hard, then handed Julie a small envelope. I'm sorry, she said softly. This is everything I know, all the emails, texts, the proof you need. I can't go back to him. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Julie took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The contents inside could change everything. It could be the evidence she needed to confront Mark, to expose him for the man he really was. And yet, in this moment, all Julie could feel was a deep, hollow emptiness. Thank you, Julie said, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't know if she meant it, but she needed to say something. The truth had come at a cost, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Karen nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Julie. I never meant to hurt you. With that, Karen turned and walked away, disappearing into the misty park, leaving Julie standing there, clutching the envelope. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her was just beginning. Julie didn't open the envelope right away. She knew that when she did, there would be no turning back. Mark's secrets would be laid bare, and whatever came next would change everything. But for now, Julie stood still, her mind reeling, as the weight of the truth settled around her like a heavy fog. Julie sat at the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air felt heavy, thick with tension as the trial unfolded before her. Mark, once the man she had trusted with her heart and her life, sat just feet away in the defendant's chair, his expression unreadable. His calm demeanor, the one that had unnerved her for months, hadn't changed. It was as though he didn't even realize the gravity of the situation. But Julie knew better now. She knew the truth. The prosecution had already presented damning evidence. The letter Julie had written before her collapse, her desperate attempt to protect herself. It had been read aloud in court, the words echoing through the room. If anything happens to me, I would never take my own life because of my children. My husband, Mark Jensen, should be the first suspect. The letter had been a lifeline, a cry for help that had been answered. It was the key that had unlocked the door to Mark's guilt. But now, as Julie watched the man who had once been her partner, her heart ached with the realization that the person he had become was someone entirely unrecognizable. The prosecutor's voice cut through her thoughts, steady and determined. Mark Jensen used manipulation and deceit to slowly poison his wife over the course of several months. He intended to kill her in order to gain control over their assets and to pursue his extramarital affair without consequence. Julie's breath caught in her throat. It felt surreal to hear those words. Her life, her marriage, laid bare in front of a room full of strangers. The lies, the betrayal, all of it exposed. But it wasn't just the legal battle that was tearing at her. It was the emotional toll of it all. The realization that the man she had once loved had been playing a dangerous game all along, and that she had almost been his pawn. The prosecutor continued, presenting a forensic expert who testified about the presence of ethylene glycol in Julie's system. The poison Mark had used, the same chemical Julie had found on Mark's computer, the same chemical that had made her body betray her. The expert explained how Mark had carefully administered small doses over time, making it seem like a series of unrelated illnesses, until the final, fatal dose. Julie's heart pounded in her chest as the expert's words hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected, but hearing it from an expert, hearing it confirmed, she could barely process it. Mark had planned her death. He had been methodical, calculating, and she had been powerless to stop him. Mark's defense attorney stood up next, trying to argue that there was insufficient evidence to convict. "This is nothing more than circumstantial evidence," the defense lawyer argued. "There is no concrete proof that Mark Jensen intentionally poisoned his wife. The letter she wrote is hearsay, and the toxicology report is not definitive." The defense's words were like knives, trying to carve doubt into the jury's mind. Julie's hands trembled, and she couldn't help but glance at Mark. He was sitting there, looking completely unfazed, as though he hadn't just been accused of trying to murder the woman he had promised to love. His arrogance, his utter lack of remorse was sickening. Julie's lawyer stood and countered the defense's argument with cold precision. "The evidence is clear," her lawyer said firmly. Julie Jensen knew she was in danger, and she took steps to make sure the truth would be heard. She left a letter, her last act of bravery. She documented her suspicions, and she fought to protect herself. Julie's mind raced. She could still remember the night she had written that letter. She had been terrified, but she had known it was the only way to make sure her children would be safe if something happened. She hadn't been sure if she would live to see another day, but she had made sure her voice would be heard. As the day wore on, Julie's thoughts kept drifting back to Mark, to the life they had shared, to the way he had turned everything upside down. She had loved him. She had trusted him, and he had shattered that trust in the most brutal way imaginable. The trial stretched on, each moment feeling like an eternity. But finally, it was time for the jury to deliberate. Julie could hardly breathe as she waited, her stomach a knot of anxiety and fear. Would they believe her? Would they see Mark for what he truly was? Or would he escape as he had before, untouched by the consequences of his actions? The hours felt endless, but eventually the jury returned. The foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Julie's world seemed to shift, her mind reeling as the weight of the verdict settled in. Mark was going to prison. He was going to face justice for what he had done. But it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like the relief she had hoped for. The truth had been revealed, but the pain of betrayal still lingered. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, Julie stood slowly, her legs weak beneath her. She had fought for her life, for her children's future, and she had won. But there was no joy in it, no satisfaction in seeing the man she once loved pay for his crimes. Julie walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. She had survived, but the scars would remain, and the journey ahead would be a long one. The room was thick with tension as Julie sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The hours had passed like an eternity since the trial began, but now it was finally coming to a close. The judge had already instructed the jury to deliberate, and every moment felt like a lifetime as Julie waited for the decision that would change everything. Mark, sitting just a few feet away, hadn't flinched or shown any emotion throughout the trial. His face remained impassive, his cold eyes staring straight ahead. He hadn't even looked at Julie once, not since the moment she took the stand and shared her truth. She had expected anger or perhaps regret, but there was nothing, only an unsettling calmness. It was as if the man she had once loved had disappeared entirely, leaving behind a stranger in his place. Julie's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions as the minutes ticked by. She had done everything she could. She had told her story. She had shared the letter, the evidence, the truth. But the fear of the unknown still clawed at her, making her wonder whether the jury would believe her. Would they see Mark for what he was? Or would they somehow doubt her, let him go free? As she glanced at the jury box, she noticed their solemn faces, their eyes focused on the foreman, who was looking down at the verdict. Julie held her breath, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her chest. The decision was out of her hands now. All she could do was wait and pray. Finally, the foreman of the jury stood up. The entire room seemed to fall into an uneasy silence. The air was electric with anticipation. Julie's heart pounded in her ears as she focused on the foreman's every move. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Jensen, guilty of first-degree murder." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Julie couldn't breathe. The room erupted into a murmur of surprise, disbelief, and relief. She sat frozen in place, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Mark was guilty. He was going to pay for what he had done to her, for what he had done to their children, for the lies, the manipulation, the coldness he had shown. Julie's eyes blurred with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, unwilling to let the emotion overtake her. She couldn't show weakness now, not when she had come this far. Mark was going to face the consequences of his actions. He would never be able to hurt her again. The judge called for order in the courtroom, his voice firm. The defendant will be remanded into custody until sentencing. Court is adjourned. Julie stood up slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. Her entire body felt like it was on fire, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She looked over at Mark one last time, her eyes locking with his for the briefest of moments. His face was still impassive, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was fear, but for the first time Julie saw him as he truly was, a man who had lost everything. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heart heavy but her spirit finally beginning to heal. She had fought for justice, for herself, for her children, and now she could finally breathe. The trial by fire was over. Outside, the cool air hit her face, the weight of the courtroom still lingering on her shoulders, but Julie felt a sense of relief she hadn't known in months. It was over. Mark had been found guilty. The truth had won. But even as she stood there, the soft hum of the outside world continuing on around her, Julie knew that this was only the beginning of her journey. She had a long road ahead, one filled with healing, with rebuilding her life, with finding peace again. But she would do it. She had to. The jury had made their decision. Mark had been exposed, and for the first time in a long while, Julie felt like she had control over her own life again. The verdict had been rendered, but for Julie, the weight of it all still pressed heavily on her. As the courtroom doors swung open, she stepped into the bright light of a new chapter. But it wasn't the relief she had expected. Mark's conviction had brought an end to the trial, but the emotional toll it had taken on her wasn't something that would simply vanish. It wasn't just about winning. It was about the wreckage of everything that had come before. Her children had been spared from the worst of it, but the trauma of what had happened would never fully fade. They knew their father was gone, taken away by his own choices, but what they couldn't fully understand was how their mother had borne the burden of all of it, alone. They had no idea of the quiet battles she'd fought, the sleepless nights, the secret fears, the moments of doubt. Julie stood outside the courthouse, the cool air biting at her skin, but the world around her seemed muted, distant. She could hear the faint murmurs of the reporters asking questions, but she tuned them out. The crowd didn't matter. The verdict mattered, yes, but not in the way they thought. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of the reverie. It was a message from Susan, her closest confidant, who had been there for her through it all. "Julie, I'm so proud of you. You're so strong. You've done it. He'll never hurt you again." Julie stared at the message, feeling a swell of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. It was true. Mark would never be able to hurt her again. But what about everything he had already done? What about the years of lies and manipulation? What about the way he had almost taken her life? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice beside her. "Mom?" Julie turned to see her eldest son, Nathan, standing by her side. His eyes were wide with concern, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had seen enough, heard enough to understand that something had happened, something big and heavy. Julie knelt down to meet his gaze, her heart aching for him. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this has been hard on you. It's all going to be okay now." Nathan didn't respond right away, but there was a long silence before he finally spoke. "Are we going to be okay, Mom? I don't know how things can ever be the same." Julie took his hand, pulling him into a tight embrace. The words were hard to find, but she knew she had to say something, something that would reassure him. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steadying. "We're going to be okay. It's going to take time, but we will be okay." But as she held him, Julie couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The trial had been a means to an end, but the aftermath was far more complicated. She wasn't sure where to go from here, or how to begin to rebuild the life that Mark had shattered. But one thing was clear: she had to be strong for her children, for herself. Julie spent the following days processing everything that had happened. The trial, the revelations, the finality of Mark's conviction. It all felt like a blur, a whirlwind that had swept her up and left her standing in its wake. She kept herself busy, focusing on her children, making sure they felt secure, loved, and supported. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and her mind wandered, the full weight of it all came crashing down. She had been betrayed. But even more than that, she had survived. And though the journey was far from over, Julie knew that she had done the right thing. She had fought for her life and for the truth. She had spoken up when others might have stayed silent, and she had been brave enough to expose the darkness that had taken root in her home. As she sat in the living room, watching her children play in the other room, Julie realized that Mark's legacy wasn't just the pain he had caused. His legacy, whether he liked it or not, was that of a man who had been exposed. He had been unmasked. And Julie? She would carry the legacy of resilience, of strength, of the truth that had set her free. It would take time, so much time, to heal from the wounds Mark had inflicted. But Julie was determined. She would rebuild. She would find peace again. And most importantly, she would ensure that her children grew up knowing that no matter what happened, they were loved, they were safe, and they were never alone. What do you think of Mark's actions in this story? How could someone betray the person they once loved so deeply? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments. Please share your thoughts and give this story a rating from 0 to 10. We'd love to hear your opinions.